The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria is a fundamentally different enemy than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's goal and end objective was the destruction of the United States and our Western allies. ISIS' goal, however, is to build a nation-state of their own. While ISIS does not yet possess all the territory it wants to control, in many respects it is already acting as a state. It prints money, has government agencies and industry, provides services to its population, and has an open immigration policy. Many, if not all, of the ISIS-affiliated groups outside of Iraq and Syria refer to themselves as provinces of ISIS. They view themselves as a state that is not geographically continuous, not unlike the United States in this respect, where Alaska and Hawaii are not continuous. ISIS' ability to carry out attacks against civilian and military/law enforcement targets of its enemies, both inside and outside of their territorial claims, is rapidly expanding. This is evidenced by their ability to down a Russian airliner leaving from the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula 2 weeks ago, and to carry out their ability last week to carry out a special forces assault on the French capital of Paris. It is time for France and her NATO allies to say that we're not going to tolerate this illegal nation-state anymore. However, we must understand, to truly rid the world of ISIS and prevent the next terrorist organization from cropping up in its place, that NATO is going to have to make a generational 25-year commitment to democratic nation building in the Middle East. When the Allied forces defeated the Axis forces in World War II, we didn't walk away or turn our backs on those countries. We helped to rebuild and governmentally redevelop Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, 70 years after that war, they are among our strongest international friends and have become cornerstones in the peaceful post-World War II international order we have toiled so long to forge. Yesterday, President Obama challenged us to offer a credible strategy for defeating ISIS other than the one his administration has been pursuing. He said he welcomes the debate, and so after conducting some basic research, here is the military and diplomatic strategy that I think would actually achieve our goals. France needs to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. An attack against one is an attack against all, and designate ISIS as the assailants. NATO needs to collectively declare that Syria is a failed state that presents an ongoing threat to us. Further, they need to declare ISIS and all of its global provinces an illegal nation-state. As I will explain later, they should also discuss declaring Yemen a failed state. NATO needs to invoke the common funding principle for all of this. The common funding principle provides an exact to the fourth decimal place percentage of the funding that each of the 28 nations is required to pay. In addition to this, NATO needs to mandate that each nation firmly commit a percentage of their total national military forces equal to their funding percentage to NATO, so that NATO can create a standing NATO armed forces. Doing this, based on publicly available figures on the size of each country's military, would equip NATO with a standing fighting force of 441,989 personnel. The next step would be to convene a week-long summit of the 9 NATO members who have a 3% funding stake or higher in NATO. They are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The presidents or prime ministers, the defense secretaries or ministers, the secretaries of state or the foreign ministers, and the head of each nation's military needs to attend this summit. At this summit, they need to break into three groups. The presidents and prime ministers need to discuss how the political will can be built and sustained to support Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya until they are fully able to support themselves. The defense secretaries and military leaders need to formulate a comprehensive strategy to take and hold all of Syrian and ISIS-controlled territories. In Syria, this will undoubtedly involve a full-scale NATO invasion and occupation until such time that Syria is rebuilt both in terms of its physical infrastructure, but also its government, both civilian and military institutions. In places like Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan, this may very well include supplementing their civilian government's military strength in substantial ways, while their nascent democracies can stabilize and become self-sustaining. In places like Egypt and Nigeria, it might be going in and taking land alongside their local forces and then leaving. Yemen is also a failed state, where Al-Qaeda and ISIS are currently fighting each other for control. NATO should strongly consider declaring Yemen a failed state and occupying it too. Meanwhile, the secretaries of state and foreign ministers need to be discussing what happens after Syria is taken. When do we let international aid organizations in? How will we rebuild? How will rebuilding be paid for and managed? How will Syrian refugees be brought back to Syria and under what conditions? How will a temporary government be established? What supervised process will Syria be allowed to engage in to write a constitution? How will Syrians interested in serving in any future Syrian military or police forces be vetted? NATO's decision to directly take out the Assad regime alongside ISIS so that the whole country can be stabilized will set us in direct opposition with the military expansionist goals of both Iran and Russia. It will force them to make a firm decision as to whether they are willing to directly target NATO forces. If so, the Allied forces have won this sort of multi-pronged global world war before, and we can do so again. It will also show both Russia and Iran that there is a limit to their own expansionism that we will not tolerate them passing. This will not be easy, nor will it be cheap, and it's going to cost a lot of people in America and in Europe their lives. It's going to require hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans and Europeans being willing to go to the Middle East, not just to serve in the military. That's important. But it's going to require diplomats, it's going to require State Department personnel, it's going to require international aid organizations from all NATO members in order to rebuild and help these people develop a sound government at the federal, state, and local levels in their country that can become self-sustaining once Western forces do leave. But this is how we win. Only when the Middle East is as stable and prosperous as Europe and the West will the war on terror ever be able to end. In the meantime, it's important to remember that we are a nation of immigrants and a nation of refugees, and that we must demand our political leaders welcome our full and fair share of Syrian refugees. I've personally written my congressional delegation letting them know that I support our efforts to welcome our global brothers and sisters in crisis. Yesterday, many of America's governors took efforts to close state borders to Syrian refugees. And while, as I understand it, it's legally impractical for them to do so, there are state benefits that are provided to refugees that they can choose to deny these people in need. That is why yesterday I called my church and I spoke with my pastor and I encouraged us, and he agreed, to look into ways that we can sponsor Syrian refugees in our local communities. It's important that when these people come over here, because they're going to come, whether some of our fellow neighbors like it or not, they're going to come. And it's important that when they do come here, they find people that are willing to welcome them, people that are willing to embrace them, people who are willing to help them. Because if we don't, if they come and all they find is hatred, and all they find is animosity, and all they have is a sense that they're not well wanted and they're not welcome, then what are they going to do? They're going to sit in their homes, on their phones, on their computers, on Facebook, talking to other people from the Middle East, which is going to lead them to people that are going to preach to them radicalization. Instead, we can welcome them, we can educate them, we can embrace them, and we can show them that our way of life and our values and our morals are big enough to accept them with love and compassion. And that is why, in the end, the West will win. But we're not going to win if we don't get serious. We're not going to win if we're not there. The United Nations is incapable of acting because Russia and China have veto power. However, NATO is not hamstrung by the United Nations. NATO can act on its own without the approval of the United Nations, without the involvement of the United Nations, and all they have to do is tell the United Nations what they're doing. I don't think that Russia and Iran want a war with NATO. I don't think their people mean us harm, and so I'm not scared of them. But we need to go in, and we need to stabilize, and we need to do what we did to Europe after the Second World War, nation build. Out of World War II came the United Nations. Out of World War II came the World Trade Organization. Out of World War II came the international order that it presently exists. Out of World War II came NATO. Out of World War II came the European Union. We can do it without a major world war. And 70 years from now, Syria, Yemen, Libya can be our strongest allies and friends, and can look at America as heroes like Japan, like Germany, and like Italy. We liberated them, we can liberate the Syrians. The Syrians are an ancient people. They are an ancient civilization and an ancient culture that goes back to biblical times. The world has greatly benefited from Syrian history, Syrian culture, Syrian discoveries. Syrian is not a backwards place. They're middle class, they're educated, they're Western leaning, their people are. They were. But they've gone through a civil war. They've been oppressed. And now they're living under dictators and maniacs. And the United States and Europe are under assault from these dictators and these maniacs. And we can defeat them, and we can return Syria and Libya and Yemen and Afghanistan to their people. And we will be embraced for such by those who love peace, by those who want prosperity, and by those of our global brothers and sisters who seek a bright future. We'll be hated by those who preach hate and destruction, But we are the United States of America, and we stand with our NATO allies. We stand with our oldest ally, France, who has been our friend since before we were a nation.